these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be a great episode because we have none other than Ben Shapiro on. You may know him. He writes a book like every 5 minutes. Writes a lot of things. I'm not sure how many columns you write, Ben, but it's a lot. Pretty busy guy. Fastest growing conservative podcast in America, as you like to say. I mean, I see no proof of this, but okay, well, I'll take your word for it. If it's true, it's true. Look, Ben, thanks for being on as always, and congrats on the new book release.
I appreciate it.
So we'll get to the book, The Authoritarian Moment. It's actually pretty relevant, especially given the past year that we've had. But we were just talking offline. I was a little late to our meeting, which I apologize for. Coming out of a classified briefing with Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, General Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Homeland Security, and our national our Director of our Director of National Intelligence, or DNI. So a basic update about what's going on in Afghanistan. And, my takeaway from it was the limited questions that we got to. There's a lot of bipartisan outrage over this self-imposed August 31st deadline. And nobody really believes what the Secretary of State is saying. And he is actually saying that he thinks all the Americans who want to leave by August 31st, we should be able to meet that deadline. That's just, I see no indication that that's possibly true. And it's frustrated me to no end. Frankly, this entire situation has frustrated me to no end. I think you and I are in agreement about what our general strategy should have been. And it was simply not followed. And I think there was bipartisan foolishness over this whole thing.
I mean, I totally agree with that. And as far as the sort of situation on the ground over there, the August 31st deadline, it started off as self-imposed, but it really now is being imposed by the Taliban because there's a push by some in the Biden administration to extend it at least a few days so we can get everybody out. And the Taliban are pushing back and they're saying, no, that's our red line. If you do that, then we can't guarantee anybody's safety beyond that August 31st date. I think that the Taliban have an interest in making sure that everybody does get out because the last thing they want is for Americans to start dying, because if Americans start dying, then Americans here are going to be unhappy enough that we might be interested in bombing the hell out of them. But I think that what is much more likely at this point, and you tell me if you agree, Dan, because you know this stuff better than I do, given that you're in the classified briefings. I think that the most likely scenario here is that we're just going to bribe the hell out of the Taliban. We're going to be spending them pallets of cash. We're going to be sending them all sorts of goodies, and they will allow the Americans to leave. And then 2 months from now, after Joe Biden has declared victory, then we'll start seeing all the pictures of Americans being humiliated, and we'll start seeing the pictures of the pallets of cash that we've sent over to the Taliban. And the reason I say this is because this is essentially what Obama did with Iran. We sent them pallets of cash. Iran later revealed that. It was humiliating for the United States. Or when the Iranians took a bunch of American seamen hostage and we got them released, and then later they built statues of the American seamen on their knees on boats in the middle of Tehran. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the way this goes. My concern beyond obviously the immediate is that I think that the game that the Biden administration is pretty obviously playing here is, okay, this is an acute crisis. If we sort of bluster and bloviate our way through it, and we buy ourselves a couple of weeks to get as many people out as we think we can, then the American people, 2 years from now, they'll forget about all of this because they actually want us out of Afghanistan. They don't care about what comes next. They're not interested in the geostrategic implications. See, to me, there are two rolling disasters here. One is the actual humanitarian situation on the ground with 10 to 15,000 Americans still stuck there, and somewhere between 60 and 100,000 members of the Afghan military or Afghan contractors, people who worked with us, still stuck there. That's one crisis. And the other crisis, which has, I think, more significant long-term effects, is all of the after effect of this, including the rise of China. China's now going to have access to tremendous amounts of American military technology. If you think the Taliban are going to be analyzing those drones we left them, they will not. The Chinese will just pay them $1 billion, and they will ship all of that technology over to China, where China will simply reconstruct the technology. This is what they are famous for doing, is stealing our IP after all. So they'll do the same thing with our military tech. The Chinese obviously are making inroads with the Taliban. They're going to get their rare earths minerals. You're going to start to see Iran ramp up its activities in the region. You're going to start to see Russia ramp up its activities. You're going to start to see American allies look around the world and say, okay, well, if the United States is this bad an ally to the Afghans, what wouldn't they do to us? and maybe we should start triangulating a little bit. Not necessarily abandon the Americans, but at least start making overtures to some of these other countries that the United States has now granted a broader role on the world stage. So the ramifications of this are going to be felt, for American foreign policy for probably decades to come. But I think Biden's calculation is Americans only see what's right here in front of their face. And so right now it's really bad, and his approval ratings are in the 40s. But if the Americans come home, then a month from now, things will be better for him. So just lie and bluster your way through it.
Yeah, that seems about right. And like this is the problem with creating foreign policy off of a public opinion poll that really doesn't get into the nuances of what we're even talking about. Because, yeah, look, a majority of Americans say, yeah, bring the troops home. I mean, this sounds good. When you're asked a question on a survey, you're always going to just say the thing that sounds good. All right. And then they're going to go back to trying to figure out what they're going to cook for dinner. Right. Because it's not like any person answering this question has put even a modicum of thought into this, first of all. But second of all, other surveys that ask a little bit more detail, like, OK, well, what about a residual security force to maintain stability and make sure Taliban doesn't take over? Would you be in favor of that after we, removed our combat troops? And you get a majority saying yes, too. So it's not like the public opinion is so singularly focused on just bringing all the troops home as Biden might expect it to be. And again, as many on our side expect it to be. One of the problems right now is we seem to be trying to salvage the old plan, which was just take everybody out. That's sort of what the actions I see on the ground. What I'd like to see, what I'm pushing for is acknowledge that there's now a new reality that we live in. And that reality has become an emergency situation of a NEO, which is a non-combatant evacuation operation. And we can't possibly do it from just Kabul airport. It's a soft target. It's easy to hit. We're getting reports now that ISIS, Khorasan, might be hitting it within the next 48 hours with VBIDs and coordinated attacks. And it's a complete disaster. I've advocated for, look, you got to retake airfields throughout the country. And and we will leave when we think that everybody who wanted to come with us is gone. And that's just what we should tell the Taliban. And if they don't like it, they can kick rocks because we're America. That should be our message. Unfortunately, you're completely right. That won't be our message. It will probably accommodate them. We'll probably pay them off, which will, of course, incentivize them to engage in the same behavior that got us to this point in the first place. Look, Biden's national security team is the same as it was under Obama. And this methodology of appeasement will continue. And it's hope and change was Obama's slogan. And that was actually the perfect way to describe his foreign policy, too. Just hope for change. If you're super nice to people, soup's nice. People will do what you want. And it's really been depressing for a lot of us who served over there.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine what it's like for people who actually served over there. For folks who, even remember 9/11. I know that's now half a generation away. It's 20 years ago. But the exact same people who performed 9/11 are now back in power. I mean, it's actually the Haqqani Network that is providing security in Kabul. The Haqqani Network is basically an al-Qaeda offshoot. The top three leaders of the Taliban right now are Mullah Omar's son. Mullah Omar was in charge of the Taliban, and the co-founder of the Taliban and the head of the Haqqani Network. And those are the people that we are handing over power to. And not only that, essentially playing PR agents for. You remember that the Obama administration did this with regard to Iran. They were so hell-bent on doing a deal with Iran that this forced them into the uncomfortable position of having to pretend that Iran had moderated and that the Iranian regime was actually a moderate regime and that their human rights predations and spread of terror all over the region, that really wasn't that big a deal. I think they're going to see the same thing from the Biden team. It'll be, well, the Taliban, they're more moderate than they were. They're more open to change. Sure, they're really bad right now, but as they, they're going to have to take their role on the world stage. And you hear Biden saying stuff like this. He said, "Oh, they have a choice to make. They have a choice." I'm pretty sure they made that choice when they decided to live in the 7th century and stuff all of their women into burqas and then into the basement. I'm pretty sure that choice was made a while ago. But the idea seems to be that choice is still on the table. Biden knows that's not true. But I think that Biden has not changed his opinion since 2010 when he told Richard Holbrooke, F it. It didn't hurt. It didn't hurt Nixon and Kissinger in Vietnam, so it's not going to hurt me now. And sadly, he might be right because, as you point out, the only time Americans typically care a lot about foreign policy is when Americans get killed. So if no Americans get killed here, I think that Biden will be able to save his own bacon. If an American gets killed, God forbid, then I think that he's in dire political trouble. So all of his focus right now is what do I have to do to get the Taliban to release everybody so I can at least claim that this was a well-planned, well-orchestrated operation, even though all evidence suggests the opposite?
Yeah, last thing I'll say on this is it's a matter of cost and benefits. This is what I've been trying to tell people for years. We all agreed to go into Afghanistan. Okay, nobody gets to say that they were like, "Whoa, guys, I knew this would end up like this. There's no point in going." Nobody gets to say that. Everybody agreed to go in there. And so from that moment on, you always had two choices. Either keep a presence there, attempt to maintain some kind of stability in whatever way we do that, or give it back to the Taliban and put us right back into the situation we were in on September 10th, 2001. We weren't at war on September 10th, 2001. Somebody was sure as hell at war with us. This is something that people forget. And so you've always had those two choices. And I think everybody who's in the No More Endless Wars crowd, who basically, again, makes their foreign policy based off of a slogan, they've always negated, they've always been in denial about those two choices, right? There's always been this sort of third utopian option to them, which was we can just have it both ways. We can just bring our troops home and also not really worry about attacks on the homeland. But that's never been an option. It's never been true. And now with all the intelligence reports coming out saying Al-Qaeda will probably be back to their old operational standards, meaning they can engage in external operations within 6 months to 18 months. That's the assessment. That's not good. ISIS they're already thinking ISIS is going to attack in the next 48 hours.
It is amazing to see how often no more endless war, that sort of slogan slides into no more war as sort of almost pacifistic utopianism. I mean, the reality is that Afghanistan was not an endless war by the time we left. We'd had one combat casualty, I believe, in the last 18 months, and it was in February of 2020. So the notion that this was in any way similar to the war that we were fighting in Afghanistan circa 2010 or 2011 is just not true. I mean, Barack Obama started announcing troop withdrawals in 2011. By 2014, we had about 10,000 troops on the ground as opposed to 30 or 40,000 troops on the ground just a couple of years earlier. And since then, we have been pretty steadily withdrawing troops from Afghanistan to the point where we had 2,500 troops on the ground by the time that Joe Biden decided that was unsustainable. That made it I believe on the list of countries where we had troops stationed, that made it the ninth most populous country in terms of number of American troops on the ground. Like we had more troops in Spain and Qatar than we did in Afghanistan by the time that we left. And also the sort of no more endless war crowd fails to acknowledge also that our opponents do believe they are fighting an endless war. So the question is, how are you going to defend yourself from that? In the same way that the Soviet Union felt that they were fighting an endless war on capitalism. And so the question was going to be always, do we cede that ground to them or do we not cede that ground to them? This isn't, a game of one hand clapping. There's another hand out there and they have an agenda. And I always find it interesting that the same people who I wish that people could muster the same passion for we need to pull out of Afghanistan that they seem not to be able to muster for pull out of Japan, pull out of Korea. We've been in Korea literally for nigh on 75 years at this point. And we still have 26,000 troops in South Korea. And it is worthwhile noting that if the United States military were to withdraw from South Korea right now, there's a serious question as to whether the South Korean regime would survive for, a plenitude of years, given the aggression of North Korea and their backing by China. So wherever the U.S., removes its boot print, bad things tend to follow. And that doesn't mean that the boot should have been there in the first place. There's a serious question to be asked about that. And the question is to, how many boots should be there, period. But when you remove all the boots, then foreign policy and nature abhor a vacuum. And that vacuum is not going to last for very long. In fact, this one didn't even last for a moment.
It's strange to me how this mentality is infiltrated so deeply into the conservative side. There's a lot of people who call me a Rhino because, I have this view of our foreign policy. It's like, okay, so I'm a Rhino. Now, granted, that's like the left calling somebody a racist, right? That's sort of the equivalent on our side. Not sure why I don't like what you're saying, but I don't like it. So you're a Rhino. Got it. But explain to me how complete isolationism and refusal to acknowledge the cost and benefit analysis of leaving or staying in a foreign intervention. I'm not sure how that makes you more conservative. It's a very strange and highly emotionally charged opinion that has occurred on our side, and I struggle to find where it came from. it's a bit strange to me. I think it.
I mean, and look, there's been this strain in American foreign policy thought on the right for a long time. I mean, paleocons have believed this for a very, very long time. Pat Buchanan was preaching this in the late 80s and the early 90s. There was this strain of isolationism inherent in sort of the John Bircherism of the 1950s. So it's not completely foreign and it's not completely brand new. The rise of it, I think, is in response largely to the unsuccess of the Iraq War over time. And the failure to acknowledge that there were some pretty significant successes in the Iraq War as well. And when it comes to Afghanistan, it just became the trendy thing to say. I mean, it was adopted by several straight presidents after George W. Bush, right? Barack Obama suggested that Afghanistan was the good war, but we needed to change our mission there to not include making sure that the regime was particularly stable. We just had to keep enough boots on the ground there to conduct counterterror, which is at least an argument. And then Trump came in and he pledged to get out of there. And then Biden came in and pledged to get out of there as well. So you have this bipartisan consensus that it was vital and important to get out of there. So I'm not going to pretend this is something new because I don't think that it is something new. I think it's new to those of us who remember 9/11. For those of us who grew up in the 9/11 era, and I was 16 when 9/11 happened, or 17. And so the sort of marked shift in American foreign policy, this recognition that America would not be left alone, and that if you just pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist, the rest of the world will find you. That went away, within probably 5 years. At the beginning, it was very partisan. The Republicans were like, well, I thought 9/11 just happened. And Democrats by 2004 were already pushing a lot of this line and talking down the Iraq War, saying we were definitely going to lose there, talking down the performance in Afghanistan by 2005, 2006. And then it started getting adopted by the right in the aftermath of Bush when Bush proved to be unpopular in his second term. So, I don't know that it's a truly ascendant philosophy on the right. I think the American people are two things. They're knee-jerk, we don't want to be involved in things. And then they are also knee-jerk, if something happens that's bad, then we want to be involved in things. And it's the job of people who actually, know things about these parts of the world to explain how they work in more nuanced detail. And you explained that at the top with regard to polling data. Like the poll number of do you wish to be in Afghanistan or not? Virtually all Americans are going to say, yeah, I wish we weren't in Afghanistan. But if you say it requires a skeleton force of 2,500 troops to secure bases against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, you for it or you're against it? Most Americans are going to say for it. So one is significantly more nuanced and more detailed in the framing.
Yeah. Now there seems to be this strange sort of sense of moral superiority if you claim to care about veterans and the troops more because you want them home safe. It's like national defense is not a bunch of SEALs on San Diego Beach just looking out over the horizon looking for the Ruskies. Like that ain't national defense, guys. You need to be forward deployed. You need to have a network of alliances. I want to move on from this, though, and maybe quickly get your take on, because as it turns out, what we're doing in Washington this week, we were called back on August recess, but not to deal with Afghanistan or even debate, maybe should we recognize the Taliban as a legitimate governing force? I think that's a worthy debate right now. I don't think we should, but, the Secretary of State is toying with that idea. That's what we should be talking about. It's not. We are talking about a giant infrastructure bill and a giant spending package, which may all get lumped into reconciliation. It's actually still unclear to me as we record this exactly what the strategy of the Democrats is going to be on this. I guess maybe a quick take from you on how detrimental this amount of spending could be for our country.
It's disastrous. I mean, I think that right now, what we are looking at in terms of the Biden Doctrine is essentially surrender abroad and then a sort of weak, slovenly gluttonousness at home. Like we're just, as my friend Noah Rothman says, we're going to just kind of sit in a warm bath and wait to die. It seems like the economic strategy here is as long as we can up the welfare benefits and spend money that has not yet been created, then, we can live in comfort the rest of our days, which is why so many people seem pretty comfortable with the level of bailouts that were put out last year during an actual pandemic and want that to continue ad infinitum. So I don't think that Biden sees the downside of this. In fact, I think that Biden actually, the downside may be the benefit. I mean, even in his sort of economic projections, the suggestion was that this year was going to go great guns, next year was going to go great guns. And then by 3 years out, we were going to be experiencing for the rest of the decade, like 1.5%, 1.6% GDP growth. That's terrible. Those are bad numbers. But that is a recognition that when you burden the economy with this amount of spending and the required amount of regulation and taxation on the other end, that you're going to destroy an enormous amount of entrepreneurship. You're going to destroy an enormous amount of job creation. And I think that Biden is kind of okay with that because he realizes that he's probably a one-term president for health reasons. And you can either go down in history as a guy who did stuff, or you can go down in history as a guy who didn't do stuff. And the presidents who tend to go down in history as successful are the ones who do stuff, whether that stuff is good or bad. Remember, FDR presided over 3 terms of a Great Depression, and 3.5 terms of a Great Depression, and he's still considered this historically wonderful president, which is kind of incredible considering he lengthened the Great Depression by at least 8 years, according to studies from UCLA. So doing stuff is much preferred in the Democratic Party to not doing stuff. And it doesn't have to bear much resemblance to reality. I am pleased that there is at least a group of House members who realize that there's going to be some blowback to them in blowing out the spending this way, that the long-term benefits may accrue to the Democratic Party because once you get people dependent on government, they tend to vote Democrat. But there may be some short-term blowback in purple districts, and Democrats could easily lose the House in 2022 over it. Honestly, I'm curious to see how it works out, because the whole play, I assume, from sort of the moderate Republican caucus, the Mitt Romneys and the Susan Collinses of the world on the infrastructure bill is, we'll trade you our support for this pared down infrastructure bill, which is still $1 trillion. And in return, you have to shoot down this $3.5 trillion budget. And I've been skeptical that Democrats were actually going to shoot down the $3.5 trillion budget. But maybe some of these Democrats in purple districts and in purple states are starting to feel the heat, given the fact that Joe Biden's approval ratings means that his administration has very little coattails. So maybe the Romney-Collins calculation will end up strategically being correct. We'll find out.
Yeah, that's really been the only defense of, I think, supporting the infrastructure bill. The infrastructure bill is not quite as bad as our side says it is, but it's definitely not good either. It's simply too expensive. That's my problem with it. I also think there's a bit of a myth that we're just not building any infrastructure. Like there's this sort of mythology out there. And look, we could certainly engage in projects that are, I think, ready and approved. Everything the Army Corps of Engineers has a backlog that are well vetted projects that we should fund. But that's like $100 billion. I'm not sure where they get $1 trillion from. It'll be interesting to see if they end up being right and the Democrats fall apart on this. I mean, they tried to get it done last night. They couldn't. We were here until 1 a.m. I like the way you point out, though. Look, I think one of the you're always good at pointing out essential differences between the left and the right. And I think framing it for people so people understand what it is we're actually debating, right? Because too often in politics, we get really mired down in this sort of, well, he's a worse person. Well, actually, remember that one guy that you voted for who's also a worse person. And then it just sort of becomes the stupid tit for tat. In reality, though, we have very different dispositions. We think very differently about the nature of governing, human nature, and how much it can be molded. And this is, I'm making a segue here into your book as well. But you talked about action. Democrats need action at all costs. And that action is a sort of a form of bribery. And I think, unfortunately, Americans have become highly conditioned to this bribery. And part of that bribery is safety. We will make you safe. We will promise you this sense of safety. This is sort of the progressive false promise you a sense of security and safety that only we can provide for you. Now, of course, the logical end to this is we'll just put you in prison. Keep you perfectly safe there. You can be in prison. It's fine. We'll feed you. We'll clothe you. You don't need to do anything. And I think this gets to sort of how you start the book, The Authoritarian Moment, how you differentiate between right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. Can you sort of expand on that and how people should think about it?
Sure. So there's been this long established phenomenon that sociologists have talked about of right-wing authoritarianism. And right-wing authoritarianism is typically characterized by obedience to rules, by willingness to use authority to cram down those rules on others. And when you think of right-wing authoritarians, you should be thinking of people like General Franco in Spain, for example. And for a long time, sociologists who tend toward the left said there was no such thing as left-wing authoritarianism. It was a total myth. It just didn't exist. There were no people on the left who were authoritarian. Now, people on the right looked at that.
They're so nice.
Right, exactly. They're just such nice people. They're just wonderful. And then it turns out that of course, is not true. And that you can use precisely the same sort of descriptors to apply to people on the left, except the sort of rule following that they want is rule following for a different purpose. So the sort of characteristics of left-wing authoritarianism are 3 in number, and this is put together by a University of North Dakota professor, I believe. The 3 sort of aspects that are most typical are a willingness to use top-down censorship, which you see in most American institutions these days, ranging from universities to your corporation, a belief in revolutionary aggression, that the institutions themselves are a problem and need to be torn down either from without or from within, and a sense of unearned moral superiority, a belief that your moral authority is greater than the other guy. That the reason that you guys disagree is because that guy's a bad person and I'm a good person. And you see all of this like all over our politics right now. And you see, again, I think there are right-wing authoritarians, but the people who are in charge of the major institutions in American society right now, corporate America, the universities, the mainstream media, social media, they're almost entirely comprised by either left-wing authoritarians or people who are extraordinarily vulnerable and willing to surrender to left-wing authoritarians. And that has a real effect on the body politic. It has an effect on how people talk to each other and think about each other. And it's really dire. I mean, there's a reason why by polling statistics, every single political subgroup in the United States, with the exception of the far left, feels uncomfortable saying what they really believe about politics. And the reason is because they're afraid that the institutions of society, including the sort of mob effect you get on Twitter or Facebook, are going to come against them if they speak what they actually believe about controversial issues. The only people who feel comfortable are people on the radical left. And that has really, I think, that the book is really less about the power of government than it is about the authoritarian mindset that has taken over all of the sort of extraneous to government aspects of American life. I think that you can easily see authoritarianism in government right now in, for example, COVID policy, which is utterly insane. And you're seeing that on the state and local level.
It's like its own method of infection. It's like its own pandemic. This sort of, and you get into you always use big words in your books, which is annoying. But okay, autocracy. Okay, it just means mob rule. All right.
Yeah.
Which is a threat.
Fancy. Fancy talk. Yep.
You intellectuals. But our founders were concerned about these things. They were very specific about creating a Republican form of government that was not a pure democracy. They were worried about mob rule. But there's sort of the government sanctioned mob rule, which I suppose would be a pure democracy. And then there's the sort of mob rule that I think you're referring to, which is much more cultural. And
yes.
And again, even with COVID policy, it's largely a culture war that we're fighting. There are legitimately a lot of. I wish we were the large silent majority on this. I don't think anybody's silent about it, but I don't know that that's true. There's plenty of people who are firmly in the camp of, I need my neighbors to keep me safe. I need to make them do things that keep me safe. I think it's taken on new heights in COVID because at least there's some sort of rationale because it's a pandemic. But that rationale expands to a lot more than just COVID as far as what I want my neighbors to do for my benefit. Maybe what I want them to say. Maybe I think they shouldn't be able to say certain things. And we're lucky to be protected by the First Amendment. But, when it comes to text censorship, the Democrats don't. I haven't seen legislation from them that would say, look, you need to censor this kind of thing more, Facebook. But they certainly have a lot of heated rhetoric that would indicate that.
Oh, they say that out loud, right? I mean, what they've said over and over and over is if you don't monitor what's on your service, Facebook, then we will for you, which, of course, Congress doesn't actually have the power to do. What they can do is, and Thomas Sowell has pointed this out, if you provide a subsidy to someone and then you remove the subsidy, that's the same as penalizing them. And that is what they've done. I mean, Section 230 is a subsidy to big tech. It is a subsidy that is designed to elicit a broader range of public opinion. And the Democrats have basically said, unless you narrow the public opinion you allow, we will remove the liability protections. So that is precisely the opposite of what conservatives have said, which is the whole purpose of Section 230 was to broaden the protections for broader speech. So you really need to keep the protections broad. This is why I'm always amused when I see some people on the right who are anti-Facebook say, well, we and Elizabeth Warren are on the same page. Like, no, you are diametrically opposed. Elizabeth Warren wants fewer things on Facebook. You want more things on Facebook. That is not the same thing at all. But it does speak to, and you're seeing this from the Biden administration right now with regard to things like vaccine mandates, right? Joe Biden said yesterday that he wants to see private enterprise place vaccine mandates on people who work for them. He's the government. Okay, so what is the next step there? That federal contractors, it's not just going to be the federal government, right? Federal contractors must be vaccine-only contractors, or people who work with federal contractors have to only be vaccine mandates. Like it gets into really dicey constitutional territory, but on an ideological level, and you do see it manifest with COVID, particularly post the availability of the vaccines. Before the vaccines, at least there was a case to be made that if you're in a public area with a lot of seniors and nobody can vaccinate, that you should put on a mask out of good grace and to protect your neighbor. But once everybody has the capacity to get a vaccine, then we are now talking about you just want to control your neighbor because you want to control your neighbor. And this is what I honestly can't fathom it. There are so many people out there who are vaccinated right? Because a huge percentage of blue cities are vaccinated, particularly the elite upper crust. These are the exact same people who are calling for mask mandates. And I just, like, I've been vaccinated since March. And once I was vaccinated, I did not care, right? Once I was vaccinated, it was, you do what you want to do. I will do what I want to do. If you choose to be unvaccinated and then, get immunity to COVID by getting COVID, that would be your choice. I think it's not a particularly smart choice depending on your age and health condition, but it is your choice. But I'm vaccinated. I took the vaccine to protect me. And I took the vaccine because, again, I think that it's a good, I had my parents get the vaccine because I think that it is important for them to get the vaccine. My wife got vaccinated. Like, I'm very, very pro-vaccine, but this desire to control other people has outstripped the science to the point where you have members of the public health establishment saying things that are overtly untrue just for purposes of control. I mean, Anthony Fauci said literally yesterday, he was on Mehdi Hassan's show on MSNBC, and he said, it doesn't matter what kind of mask you put on. Don't worry about that. Just put on a mask. Okay, the data are very clear that cloth masks do virtually nothing with regard to Delta, and the surgical face masks are only about 10% effective, and that's if you use the mask properly. They're only about 10% effective against Delta. So no, that's not correct. And then Joe Biden came out, and in complete defiance of all available science, he said that every time your child goes outdoors, leaves the front door, you should mask your kid. Okay, that is not designed because he is worried about what your kid is going to do based on the science. The risk of your child dying today from COVID, if your kid is under 18, the risk to your child dying of COVID is lower than the risk of you dying from COVID post-vaccination, right? If you're 40 and vaccinated, you still have a higher risk of dying from COVID, last I checked, than a 2-year-old does of dying from COVID. So what exactly are you talking about? It is now, it goes back to something you mentioned before, which is there's an almost religious belief on the left that government is capable of solving all problems. This is the biggest problem most of us have seen in our lifetime. So if government is incapable of solving the problem, this challenges the leftist worldview. And so the question is, okay, what's the solution to that? Either you can rethink the idea that government is capable of solving all problems, or you can say that the real problem here is that you haven't masked harder, right? Well, the real problem here is you, right? It's Principal Skinner. It's not me who's wrong. It's the children who are wrong. and that mentality, I think, is pervasive.
It is. I mean, and I think conservatives have something to offer here that maybe we don't do a good enough job. We're always very reactive to the left. And another thing I find interesting, by the way, is our complaints about ourselves. If you go read like leftist literature on how they can do better, they have the exact same complaints. They believe that we have all the institutions. They believe that like we have the media power, that we have the emotional reasoning while they have all the facts. I swear, I was just reading a book. It's called Don't Think Like an Elephant. It's a fascinating book. And they think the same things. I don't know. It's a little tangent, but it's interesting in how we go through with this. But we have something to offer the American people, because I think most people are on our side with this, which is basically a live and let live philosophy. Now, to an extent, like you and I are not libertarians, and I think there's a big difference between a conservative and a libertarian. We're just more closely aligned than, say, what the left is. But there's a lot of Americans that do believe in a live and let live philosophy with most things. And I don't know that conservatives have done a great enough job maybe selling that point. And also, I would say selling the challenge and the adventure of personal responsibility. And I love the way, this is how Jordan Peterson talks about it. And he sort of got me to start thinking about it this way. Stop talking about a lack of personal responsibility as a problem, but talk about it as a challenge and an adventure that you embark upon that gives you the dignity of individual freedom and the dignity to pursue your happiness as our Declaration of Independence prescribes. I think it is something we can offer. It's wildly against authoritarianism. Again, it's interesting how Donald Trump is called an authoritarian all the time. Maybe he talked like one, but he certainly never took action like one. But that sort of gets lost in the mix.
No, that's right. And I think that the point that you make there is exactly right. And it does go to two visions of what freedom constitutes. For the right, freedom lies in the ability to find meaning in your life. And most people find meaning in their life by obligating themselves, right? This is Jordan's point, is that most of the thing on your deathbed, the stuff that you are going to think about having spent your life doing properly is the time you spent with your wife, the time you spent with your kids, fulfilling your obligations to others, helping your community, quote unquote, building a better world. For the left, the stuff that gives you freedom and meaning is freedom from obligations, right? Well, this is why they're always talking about freedom from want, right? There can't be true freedom until we have provided for all of your needs. Well, that's a certain, it's a sort of an empty view of what freedom actually constitutes. For conservatives, freedom comes with responsibility because freedom is impossible without responsibility. For the left, freedom from responsibility is sort of the point. And so if government can act as the sort of buffer zone between you and reality, then that's government's job. And that's a real problem because reality does not care about your buffer zone. Reality is not interested in whether the government pretends that it can stop a pandemic or whether the government pretends it cannot stop a pandemic. The COVID is just going to hit whom it hits. And this is what we're finding out right now worldwide, right? We're seeing that in Israel, they have an 80% vaccination rate, and they right now have more people in the hospital than they've had any time since last summer. They have an extraordinary number of people. I think they had 10,000 infections today. Now, that is the highest number that they've had in months and months and months. You've seen in Australia, they're trying to block out reality by locking down 25 million people on the basis of about 700 cases and about 3 dead a day. So you can either put your faith in government to protect you from all the risks of the world, or you can recognize when there is an outsized risk that sometimes requires government intervention, and then the rest of the time realize that risk sort of exists and that does not alleviate you of your responsibility to be a good person to other people, but it does mean that other people do have to leave you alone. And I think conservatives have a lot to sell here, which is why people are flooding to Florida, for example, and they're not flooding to New York or California in the same way. When people are asked their opinions, I think that they tend to think about how they want to think about themselves. But when people act in the real world, their feet are taking them to Florida and their ideas are taking them too often to New York. And I think that people ought to get with they ought to get past their own cognitive dissonance and realize that probably their feet have the right idea.
Yeah, I mean, we need to live in reality. It gets back to our Afghanistan conversation. You got to live in reality, not the world you wish you lived in. That would make you feel better. Talk about the time we have left. The tactics that the left has used, this renormalization, as you call it, the tactics that they've used to achieve more and more authority in the sort of especially in the cultural sphere. Where we are in that fight, maybe. I mean, where do we stand? Should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? How are we doing? And then how do we reverse it?
So I'm pretty optimistic that the pushback has begun on a large number of these particular issues because I think the left pushed too far too fast. So the process of renormalization, as described by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, is that you have, to take an example, a family of 4. You have a daughter in the family who decides that she's going to start eating vegan. She comes home one day. She says, listen, Mom, you can make whatever you want for everybody else, but I need vegan food. Now Mom has a decision. Does she make vegan for the whole family, or does she only make vegan for the daughter and another meal for everybody else? And so she says, listen, I only have time to make one meal. It's vegan for everybody tonight. Now the family goes to a block party. Same logic applies. We're all eating vegan because of Jessica over here. You can make 2 meals. The block party person goes, well, maybe I'll just put out some chips and dip and that'll be as good as it gets. And now you have 20 people who are eating vegan because of Jessica. That sort of process of renormalization is very common in institutions. You see it happen all the time. You have to have an intransigent and aggressive minority declaring that they will not be moved on a particular issue. And they can move a bunch of people in the middle so long as they're not asking too big a sacrifice. So this relies on a couple of things. 1, the sort of apathy of people in the middle. And 2, an ask that is not too big. The problem, the left has taken advantage of the apathy of most Americans toward politics. Most Americans don't follow politics, right? The biggest shows on Fox News might get 4 million viewers a night. There are 340 million people in America. So, most people are not following politics day to day. But the apathy is there. But the problem for the left is that they overcome the apathy when they do things that are totally crazy. And the left, over the last couple of years, has started pushing things that are totally crazy, ranging from men can be women to the police are bad and we should get rid of the police. And once you push that hard, there is going to be pushback. And I think that the kind of normal apathetic politeness that most Americans have toward politics is dissipating pretty quickly. I think that Trump, frankly, was a symptom of that. I think a lot of people on the right were like, listen, for a long time, we've put up these sort of very polite candidates like Mitt Romney or John McCain, and we've gotten bullied and we've gotten pushed around. And so I don't care what else Trump says bad stuff about. He says bad stuff about you, and you deserve it. And so we're going to vote for that. And I think that is the sort of gut level love that a lot of the base have for Trump personally. But I think that broadly applied, right, not applied to a specific person, broadly applied in the sense that we are not going to move from our ground and that apathy is no longer an option and that niceness with regard to aggressive behavior is not a solution. I think that's taking root, and I think it's taking root with a broader and broader segment of the population. And I think that that's, it's dangerous in the sense that any sort of polarization is dangerous, but it's good in the sense that I'd rather have the polarization than a monopole, than have a monopoly the way that the left had until very recently in the cultural sphere.
Yeah, I think we should be optimistic too. Another reason I might say that is because, if you look at, this is what I tell people all the time who are upset and frustrated. I say, look, 20 years ago, who were your thought leaders in the conservative movement? And maybe you could name Rush Limbaugh. There's not that many. We didn't have this sort of institutionalized, I think, conservative influencer cabal is the best, I guess, phrase that I can come up with for it. But, you weren't around 20 years ago. I mean, you were around, but not really around, not like you are today. And there's plenty. I think there's plenty more examples of influential conservatives that are also making the right arguments. Now, of course, as always, we have plenty who I think make the wrong arguments and maybe take us a few steps back. But for the most part, we've learned to operate in that sphere of, say, entertainment. I mean, look, as a congressman, I understand that I have to operate in that sphere. I jump out of airplanes sometimes, right? And what is that for? It's for pure entertainment. Okay. Now, the problem is if you don't use that entertainment towards good ends. There's a lot of performers up here that just like to perform, but then they don't have any substance on the back end. I believe that you grab people with entertainment and then you deliver them some substance and also do your homework on why we believe what we believe. I think we're doing better on that than we had before. I think we still have problems, but I think we should be optimistic in that sense. You guys at Daily Wire are, you've gotten into the movie making business, for instance. I mean, and maybe talk to us about that. As far as our solutions go, where can we do better? Do we have a chance of transforming some of these institutions like the mainstream media? Even some of our federal government institutions. You look at something like the State Department, it's just over 90% Democrat leaning. These institutions, our educational institutions, are no longer transformative. They're no longer transforming people that come into them. They're allowing themselves to be transformed by sort of the cultural mob. And I think that's how we lost universities. But how do we fight back against that, or do we have to create our own?
So those are the two alternatives, right? And I think that it depends on the institution as to which tactic we use. So some institutions are too far gone. I don't think you're going to infiltrate Hollywood and make it neutral to conservative ever again. So you just have to build an alternative. And so we're doing that at Daily Wire. They've thrown half the American population out of the theater. And so we are welcoming them into another theater. And hopefully we'll have increased offerings and bigger budgets to do exactly that sort of stuff.
I'm a really good actor. I'm a really good actor. I don't know if you know that, just in case.
Oh no, we're gonna have you at the very least cameo, and so that's some stuff that we're working on out here. There are other institutions that are still up for grabs, and here I think particularly of corporate America, where corporate America is still answerable to its shareholders, despite its most ardent attempt to make itself answerable to quote unquote stakeholders, which is just another way of saying we're not answerable to our shareholders. Stakeholder capitalism is one of the dumbest ideas ever, but shareholder capitalism is still the preferred model. And there can be moves made within these corporations. If you have 100 members of your corporation who sign a letter to management saying they want Black Lives Matter messaging on their webpage, you can get 200 members of your corporation to sign a letter saying no. And then the corporation has a choice to make. You can, as a shareholder, actually impact how these businesses are run. And again, because it exists in the private market share makes a difference, and you can launch competitors that actually fight back against these sorts of dominant institutions. There are other institutions that, like the university structure. I think the one good thing about the university structure is online is going to destroy it. It's just a question of how long. And that also can be solved by the business community. The real reason that people are willing to spend $200,000 sending their kid for a lesbian arts degree at Swarthmore is because that degree still means a better job on the other end, because you still have the Swarthmore degree. When businesses start doing what we do at Daily Wire and we don't screen for college applicants, instead we will look at we'll look at where you've worked before. We'll look at your work experience. We'll maybe look at your GPA from high school, right? We'll look at other metrics. Then the sort of bargain that is inherent in college goes away. And I think that is going to be a good thing. So I'm optimistic about taking back some of these institutions. I'm optimistic that a lot of these other institutions are making themselves vulnerable to outside influence. The ones that are the hardest are the ones that have actual control over the means of dissemination. And that's where you get into big tech or Amazon Web Services, places that people have sunk billions of dollars into building this massive infrastructure on the basis of its neutrality. And then they've turned around and become not neutral. That's really a problem. And that's really scary. And it means that they have a really big head start in that space. But again, the best that you may be able to do in some of those circumstances is at least remove the government monopoly that's been granted to some of them. And in other cases, you can build competitors.
I think that's a great answer. I'll be respectful of your time. But I have to note, okay, you've been on my podcast twice. Let's be honest, this is one of the greatest podcasts you could probably be a guest on. I mean, just a lot of people say that, Ben. A lot of people. Okay, they say it's the best. But you only had me on yours once. Do you still do the Sunday specials? I love the Sunday specials. I haven't seen one in a long time. It's just COVID
they've gotten a little bit rarer because it was hard to get people to come to studio because of COVID. Hopefully, we'll start getting back to doing those a little bit more often. We've been doing some of them remotely, and we also kind of wanted to. I'll be honest. Like after we had you, Dan, we started to think, Dan was really good, but I got to say that the general characteristics of the people we're having on is starting to drop somewhat. And so we really need to up our game. So better to do it, once every 3 weeks and make the guest excellent, as opposed to, once every week and suddenly you have Michael Knowles on. You're like, why, God, why?
He's the worst. Is your book selling better than his empty book?
Yeah, I will say that all three of my last books have sold better than his empty book did. And his empty book sold really well. That did really well.
Surprisingly
and I got no
well.
royalties from that. And I wrote as many words in that book because I wrote thorough on the cover with my name. I wrote as many words in that book as he did. I got zero money from that. And I got him in advance from a publisher to take his self-published book and then have it published by Simon & Schuster. And I will never forgive myself for that. It is just horrendous.
Oh, man. That's sad. Poor Michael Knowles. He takes so much heat from you. I mean,
but he also takes so much money from me. So, I feel like it weighs in the balance.
You created him. I mean, jeez.
Yeah.
I love it. All right. Well, you know what? I'll look forward to that invite then. But
sounds good.
And hey, thanks for being on. Appreciate it. And look, it is a great book. Your work often is, and it's worth reading. Got to say, really, I just always appreciate your expertise on things and your take on things and the way you frame the arguments for the conservative movement. It's more important than ever. I mean, the biggest threat, I think, to conservatism is us not understanding what makes us conservative and why our arguments are better than the left. That, we can talk about fighting all the time, and I put fighting in quotation marks. And people often, when they say that, they mean yelling and screaming. They mean performing for some kind of fundraising mechanism. What it really needs to mean is argumentation that is effective and that is persuasive. So if we're not persuading anybody to our side, that fighting doesn't have an outcome of winning. And I would think that winning is the actual goal. And so appreciate your enormous contributions to that effort, Ben.
I'm back at you, Dan. Appreciate the time.